You all for coming back from a short lunch. And this is the closing session of today and of the conference and of our INTREPID journey, so I feel almost a little bit emotional. I just had to say goodbye already to a couple of colleagues who had to take a plane. Okay, so I would like to start. This whole session is based on 4 speakers that have kindly agreed to come and share their ideas, their experience, and their challenges with us on the topic of the future of universities. Let me start immediately by asking Chris to begin, to open the dance.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I'm really pleased to be here and also quite excited actually to be given the opportunity to present on this particular topic. And I think that Olivia and I, we have a history together, and from that point of view, I think it also fits into what we have discussed in the past few days, probably indirectly, but I felt that it has been touched upon in several discussions. And if we can dig a bit deeper here today, we could literally look at the dimension in terms of further education and learning in this 21st century. So it's a big title, but it's basically about what we could potentially do in the future as well. So I came to this topic actually because of my own research in India, and I like to mention this because it is important as a discovery that I have made empirically working with people in India who mentioned this during research about risk and how they perceive risk and how they use faith and belief and their inner resources to cope with difficult situations. And we are also apparently facing crises, challenges, problems, big issues, grand challenges, and that's where I would like to pick up from. So I want to start with a quote here from an Indian sage, Sri Aurobindo, who was also a philosopher, and he identifies an evolutionary crisis in our consciousness. For him, the evolving consciousness and the potential of consciousness was very important, and this also shows the developmental potential that human beings actually have. And he was living in the first half of the 20th century. It's about 100 years ago that he made the statement. His yoga is called integral yoga, and I will briefly go into what this means a bit later on, because it relates also to our discussions of transdisciplinarity and knowledge creation. Now, almost 100 years on, we have thinkers and scholars who build on this and also relate this further in the context of our knowledge creation. Ken Wilber started a discussion and debate about the marriage of sense and soul, of science and religion and spirituality, of how we can bring together the inner world and the development of consciousness. And he also links it now to the crisis that we are facing. So how can we evolve as human beings, and what does it mean for the evolution of our inner consciousness? And he argues we need to overcome this by widening our consciousness, being more embracing. So that's the key message. Now, as we move on, and this is something that appeared in the discussions here, there are scholars of various kinds with different disciplinary backgrounds as well, who state that we are facing an existential crisis. And this existential crisis, similar to what Einstein called, we need to think out of our mental frameworks and move beyond these, is the critique and the analysis that they are taking. Fritjof Capra, Otto Scharmer, but also Thomas Homer Dixon, who is working on the collapse of human civilization and how can this be overcome, this existential crisis, these thinkers argue, can be tackled, addressed, dealt with, not only by our materialist and deterministic approaches, but also need to address our spiritual interiors, intentional spiritual resources, at the same time thinking about a synthesis of our knowledge. And that is what relates this also to the transdisciplinary discourse. I don't want to dig deeper into the theory review, but this is one of the approaches that has become more popular. Yes. So this crisis, from this perspective of our interior, relates to keywords like the alienation that humankind has with the natural or environmental context, but also the alienation of our individual self to our larger self, to our social context, to our planetary environment, and Sharma calls it the spiritual cultural divide. So how can we overcome this divide? How can we work on this? And one issue that comes up here is that we need to, of course, question our Western mindset, as I would call it. How do we work as academics? How do we work within a scientific academic context? And what are the constraints in terms of including our interior realms in the discussion? So the transformation of the self towards a collective self. That's the difference with the small and the capital S indicated here. Would mean that there is a developmental potential. Now, I mentioned it briefly already. The interior cannot be thought without the exterior, and this is a very important point. Even though I'm stressing on the interior, it always coexists with the exterior world, and this is what integral theory is highlighting with these four domains. These are basically the domains of different realities, the reality of our subjective existence, our intentional and interior personal world, but also our intersubjective cultural worlds. How do we create culture which is based on our values, on our worldviews, are on the left side. This is the interior collective and individual world, while on the right side, we see the more material representations of this. And this is the coexisting element of the framework, while on the right side you see now what would be the developmental potential, the co-evolution of these four realms, the interior and exterior, and the intermeshing. So the idea that as an individual, I evolve psychologically. From a child, I create or I become more aware about myself, and I reach a state where I am also aware not only of myself, but also of my collective context. That is reflected also in a collective process. And it is not too far-fetched if we think about this in terms of globalizations and interconnections. So this is very much about understanding interdependence and interconnectedness. And that's why this is the developmental aspect, the co-evolutionary aspect. This builds on transpersonal psychology and research in developmental psychology. So you all are probably aware of the ontogenesis, how we develop as individuals, and phylogenesis, how we develop as societies. So that is very important, I think, as a statement, because this also means that we can evolve further beyond our cognitive realms. Now, when you talk about this within an academic context, and you mention spirituality and the inner worlds, you are usually easily charged as an esoteric. And I thought, okay, I need to address this by using academic sources and resources to be taken seriously, basically. And I started mapping where do I find people who are acknowledged academics, and I started mapping where do these people stand in terms of their theoretical and conceptual content. And this is an overview of this. I just briefly mentioned these integrative or neo-integrative approaches. So Wilber's integral theory, but also Roy Bhaskar's philosophy of meta-reality. And he is an interesting character because he bridges Eastern and Western knowledge. He is actually a UK-based scholar, a social philosopher, but he is of Indian origin. So he has integrated Indian Vedanta philosophy with his social theory. And then I have gone through some others to point out that the disciplines are also significant. Management theory has been more open to work with the inner growth and inner development of people, mostly to be more effective and efficient and to be more successful. But Theory U is one of these quite interesting outcomes. So these are just a few pointers, and of course religious studies, they also look into spirituality and social change. And this I found helpful to look at this from a much larger picture. So how can we actually integrate interiority, and what is the conceptual theoretical foundation for this? So post-secularism, a term coined by Jürgen Habermas, brings faith, communities and religion back into the public realm. And that is very much related to the debates we had about how urban space and place change. So in the European context, this relates to religious buildings, for example. Transdisciplinarity also opens the door for integrating spiritual and the interior world, simply because the argument is we would like to include all modes of knowing. And so I have been working through this, and I think this is a helpful matrix or foundation. Now, with this analysis, we look at what is going on actually in terms of change. And many authors started with, we need the great transformation, we need a great transition, or we need a great turning. So this is now where we talk about profound transformational change. And the spiritual traditions, they have been working with this kind of transformation at the deeper personal level. And I would like to look at this from the point of view what type of knowledge is actually relevant here. So how can we step out of this cave where we are in at the moment that makes us believe that we see the reality? And that's why I'm using this term from Vedanta philosophy, Maya, which is illusion, but it also means ignorance. And ignorance means we are using maybe not all available types of knowledge, or only particular types of knowledge. So in Vedanta philosophy, there is a type of knowledge that is called phenomenal knowledge, the knowledge of the outside world as we can observe it here. And then there is a type of knowledge that is considered the higher knowledge. That is the knowledge of our own personal experiential knowledge that we gain through introspection, through contemplation, also through a meditative state. So from that point of view, we can argue this would open a door to going beyond the cave, stepping out of the cave. I don't want to use enlightenment, but the argument would be to use this type of experiential knowledge that we only gain from our insight. And I liken these two types of knowledge, the lower knowledge, to the scientific, intellectual knowledge, while the higher knowledge may be knowledge related to wisdom, maybe. And this is a term I think we haven't really discussed here, but I would like to introduce this term as important when we talk about knowledge types. So is this transformation already happening? And this is a cultural project of change, actually, of foundational change, a global transformation of values. And where does it start? So there are a number of authors working towards this to understand these changes from a post-modern world towards a trans-modern world that uses a trans-rational approach, which is not reductionist in terms of the sciences that we are applying, but tries to understand and reintegrate human existence with the natural world. That is what this picture on the right-hand side is trying to capture here. The scientific world in combination with our inner worlds. And the spiral means that there is always scope for development. This is the evolutionary spiral. So we have the potential maybe within us of transformational change. Now, this is not some basic hocus pocus, but it is an idea that is based on empirical research. For example, Paul Ray in the US did a study about the cultural creatives, and also the World Values Survey is related to this, that tries to understand global change by understanding values change, which moves towards a planetary understanding, to understand environmental awareness, that people become more aware, and also less dependent on material gains only. This is reflected also in what has become known as the new spirituality. And this I find interesting because we would like to look forward as well. What does future studies, for example, contribute to this? Because with issues of climate change and environmental degradation, we are looking at the impacts this might have in the future, and how can this probably evolve and change. And here the youth, the young people, are quite significant. And this report, which was submitted in 2013 to the Club of Rome, is quite instructive because it actually suggests that there is a changing awareness among young people in particular towards more self-reflection, towards finding meaning in life, and what does this actually mean for oneself, but also in the context of changing social and economic conditions. And therefore, this whole aspect of personal growth and action, or to do something to change the world, becomes important. And that's what I would like to highlight here. This new spirituality has been diagnosed or identified by a number of scholars, especially from religious studies. So I have been stepping out really far from my own background as an urban planner and also a social anthropologist to look at literature that tries to understand this. So popular spirituality, alternative spirituality, secular spirituality, people who are aware and probably develop or have the intention to develop their inner self, but are maybe not religious or don't follow a particular religious practice. That's the significance of this. And to me, this boils down to an age-old question that many religions, but also philosophies hold, and this is to know thyself, to know yourself more deeply and better. And maybe if you recognize yourself here, then you probably have meditated enough already, otherwise maybe not. So this is just to exemplify how in different languages, this is one of the key notions to start from with yourself. But And that is very often also a charge that spiritual practice is something that is only concerned with yourself. And I think this is not true, because most of the teachings of learned persons who use these practices, they argue that this changes your relation to your environment, to other people, to your living environment, and also your stance actually to any kind of issues and so on. And therefore, scholars have argued there is something like practical spirituality that is of relevance, and it demonstrates what this quote here argues, that there is self-transformation, cultural transformation, and world transformation. That is the kind of promise or the notion that is underpinning this. Now I have a few slides left that relate this to the educational and teaching context. And this is translated from a fascinating book that came out in 2013, and is actually about how the university and the academic and science system in Germany should be redirected and transformed to accommodate and to address these global challenges. And that's the bottom line here that I marked in red. So transformative learning, transformative change. And here we see that wisdom is one of the, that wisdom and presencing is one of the important dimensions in terms of individual change. And at the institutional or organizational change, it is also reflexivity. So how are we actually doing things? So a foundational questioning of this. And this would lead to a whole context of transformative science. This is something that we might want to pick up later in the discussion, but I think in terms of the framing, it's important to point this out. Now, what does this inner world actually bring up in terms of themes and topics? And what is recurring here is this expansion of one's relational conditions. What are they based on? As human beings, it is compassion, it is love, it is care, embracing each other's perspectives. So this whole questioning of empathy and the struggle you have had in your own process to understand each other, it requires a lot of these kind of aspects. And of course, wisdom and creativity. But how can we train this? How can we learn this? So in an educational context, this is a question. And I have a few slides, just 3 now, to point towards examples. This is an example taken from Oroville, where a learning program was designed in 2016 that is basically about discovering your own calling or purpose in life. And as you can see, it is about connecting your inner development with outer manifestation. How can you make a difference, and how can it be satisfying for yourself? And the learning process is self-directional. It is self-referential. So you work actually on yourself through dialoguing, through discovery, and discovering your potential. And it is immersive, so it's a residential course of 4 weeks where you discover different projects, but also yourself. And we can discuss this further, because this is a program that is outside the current university system, but I would declare this as a kind of higher education entry point in terms of what it is trying to achieve. And to give you another example, I was involved in a new module that was designed at the Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies, and it ran for the first time in the past winter semester there. And this is an example how within an existing university system, in fact, this topic has been integrated in a Master of Environmental Science and Management. So I know from the colleague who has been working on this that it wasn't easy to convince her colleagues on this topic, and she was also keen to actually introduce the practices that come with it. But she said she had to leave this as an option outside the actual teaching plan and curriculum. So just to give you an idea of what the constraints and what the, but also the potentials are here. And the last one relates to an idea that we discussed yesterday. So can there be a new urban practitioner? And that's an example from India again, which builds on integral education, a long tradition in the Indian context, building on Sri Aurobindo, building on Rabindranath Tagore, who all set up schools with the idea of holistic education. And as you can see, this looks at the self, what is actually my role as a planner also in the social context. At the top there, the sensibilities, being courageous, being reflexive, and so on, but also relating yourself as a practitioner to society and the environment and professional practice. So this raises all these questions of ethical and responsibility and how you relate yourself. Unfortunately, this hasn't been implemented so far, but I think it's a nice food for thought, basically, to think of a particular discipline and how to integrate the inner world. These are a few conclusions. Relearning being. So how can we actually reorganize and restructure education for sustainability? Finding one's calling or vocation. So how does this and how can this be integrated? Immersion, learning on real-world projects and using maybe living labs. And then this interplay of knowledge and wisdom. So how does wisdom matter? Which then brings us also to questions of ethical frameworks and the constraints. So it is also a normative underpinning that comes with this. And finally, transformative practices. So these are practices how we can actually develop ourselves. Any practice from meditation to contemplation, also relational practices, for example, in the Theory U framework as a collective effort. So I have taken up almost all the time, but I bet that we have more time during the panel.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Christ. We do have, yeah. I'm afraid we have 1.5 minutes. And I want to pause. This was a tremendously rich talk, and it's a great contribution to our reflection. It touches upon many things that we've either actually spoken about or implied, and many others that we have not. I don't really know if I want to use the last minute to scramble for questions and answer. So maybe I would like to use the 1 minute to just pause and to invite the next speaker, and we use the panel discussion. Is that all right with everyone? Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. That was very, very rich. Thank you.